Now we finally get to the question, what is life from the perspective of thermodynamics? Well, it's a question that's not new. Actually, Erwin Schrödinger wrote a very influential book on what is life, and how he described it is that basically a living cell, to maintain its living, consumes food just like we consume carbohydrates in form of pizza or other carbohydrates. Well, the living cell consumes food, and food is mass with low entropy. It maintains its metabolism and produces heat, and the heat being added to the environment at a certain temperature. Remember Clausius, delta Q over T produces entropy or increases the entropy. And on the other hand, we have waste flux that is mass with a higher entropy. So the molecules contained in the food are not gone, they're not lost. They are, of course, being maintained, but the energy, the useful energy in the food is being consumed by the living cell to maintain its metabolism. So in that sense, life, we could say, is chemical disequilibrium. Well, chemical disequilibrium. Well, to be honest, in high school, I never liked chemistry. So I want to sort of very briefly explain what chemistry does from a very simple physical perspective. So when we have an initial reaction, or when we have a very simple reaction, I use here a hypothetical reaction where we have two reactants, A in red and B in blue. They react and form a product that we call AB. Now, this equilibrium we have when at the beginning, we only have the reactants. It's just like our hot cup of coffee that we used already as an illustration of low entropy. Well, what then happens is that, there are some reactions going on, and these reactions, they convert the reactants into products and then maybe release some heat or take up some heat. It depends on the chemical reaction. And the speed of this reaction depends on the concentrations. It's what's called the law of mass action, somehow feasible, that you have a certain reaction constant, but then it depends on the concentrations of A and B to form the products. And as this reaction takes place and continues, eventually there will be a backward reaction. The products will turn back into reactants, because there we have a reverse reaction. It's not very easy to see here in light gray, so that you have a reverse reaction with a reverse reaction constant and the concentration of the products AB. And then eventually what we have is some form of chemical equilibrium, where the forward reaction and the reverse reaction actually are equal to each other, and there is no net reaction and no change in the composition. And so in this equilibrium, we have here, one can write that also in mathematical form. So the forward reaction is equal to the reverse reaction, and then one can actually derive the equilibrium constant associated with this. It's the ratio of the two reaction constants, and that's a well-known relationship that depends on temperature, with delta G here being the Gibbs free energy of the reaction, and it's an exponential function of minus the delta G over KT. Well, how does this now relate to, so this is just a chemical reaction. What about sort of more sort of, how do we maintain this equilibrium, and how do we maintain, let's say, a cycle of life? So if life depletes some form of food, someone needs to produce the food, and then living cells consume the food, so it's a cycle. Well, one way to maintain a chemical cycle is by transporting the reactants and products between places with different conditions, for example, with different temperatures. So what's shown here in the bottom, and let's say this is a warm place, and that favors a certain concentration. So we have a reaction going on here, bringing the A and B into this compound AB. And then on the other hand, at some other place where it's colder, AB goes back into A and B. And overall, so that already emphasizes that transport is really important. But at the same time, what we actually have is that there is heat being transported by the whole system. That means that there is heat uptake by this reaction where it is warm, and heat is being released where the place where it is cold. This is actually also something that one can understand from the principle of Le Chatelier, but I'll leave that aside here. Instead, I want to go to a practical example to sort of not make it so theoretical, because actually the hydrological cycle is a very nice example of what one could call a chemical cycle, because it's a very simple chemical reaction because it's simply a phase transition. So it means that liquid water becomes a gas or gas becomes a liquid. And here we also have an equilibrium state where we have some exponential dependence on temperature known as the saturation state. This is described by what's known the Clausius-Clapeyron relationship. And but what I want to show here is, so evaporation takes place where it is warm. It's taking place at the surface. Liquid water evaporates, forms gas, so heat is being taken up. This heat is being released in the colder atmosphere when it condenses. And because there's a temperature difference, the whole hydrological cycle is a cycle in disequilibrium in form of unsaturated air. And it is a dissipative system because it produces entropy because heat is transported across different temperatures. Now, we can describe the whole biosphere as such a dissipative system. It is driven by the producers. I put them here at top. They use solar radiation, the low entropy energy source. Producers, basically photosynthesizers, organisms that that perform photosynthesis, they create disequilibrium in form of carbohydrates and oxygen. And it's that disequilibrium between those two compounds that stores chemical energy. Well, why is it disequilibrium? Well, very simple. We can burn carbohydrates and convert it back into CO2 and water. And this is exactly what the consumers do. Now, also the producers actually need some of that disequilibrium because they also need to live on something. But overall, we have a dissipative process. We have solar radiation, low entropy energy source being taken up by the producers. And when these producers or consumers metabolize and produce heat, then this energy that was taken from sunlight is being released as heat at a much cooler temperature. So it's heat with a high entropy. So producers generate disequilibrium, consumers deplete it. So with this, we can actually also formulate a uniform, sort of a very general way of measuring the activity of the biosphere, which I think is very nice because we can also apply it to non-biotic, to abiotic processes. And that is, we can quantify what's the generation rate, what's the production rate of the producers to create chemical disequilibrium. And because that generation of disequilibrium in a steady state is equal to the dissipation of the consumers. And so we can measure the activity of the biosphere, how active it is thermodynamically in the form of generating or dissipating this disequilibrium. So with this, we can actually summarize, what is life? Well, life is chemical disequilibrium, just like what Schrödinger actually formulated many years ago. And we can view the whole biosphere as a dissipative system where producers use sunlight to create chemical disequilibrium in form of carbohydrates and oxygen, and then metabolism is actually depleted to maintain the cells, and including the consumers, they form a cycle of like a dissipative system taken together. And so we can actually also then use it to characterize better environments because they are the ones that where the producers can produce more and the consumers can consume more, and overall the whole biosphere becomes more dissipative. So this is about what is life, and the next video we are going to look at what are actually the limits to life, what's the environmental limits that set the limits to this dissipative activity.